Today's daf we're going to be learning is Masechet Zevachim Daf Kuf Yud Chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Susan Kashdan in loving memory of Yitzchak ben Moshe Chone. Okay, it's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started. Reminders to sign up for your Siyum on Sunday. Remember, there's no regular class on Monday. You can listen to the introduction to Masechet Menachot on Monday, and you can sign up for the Menachot workshop if you're in Israel. If you're in Israel also and you want to join a Siyum, there's a few Siyumim happening in Jerusalem, in Modi'in. There's one in Netanya, in the local school, in the Openat Bar Ilan. There's a bunch going on. You can find the details on the Hebrew side of our website in the Siyum registration. Okay, with that, we'll get started. And the Megillah Challenge is starting also on Monday. So a lot of things going on. We're going to get started. Starting with the Amar Mar, going back to the section we learned the braita with 5 different opinions about what exactly went on in the time of Gilgal when there was a Mishkan there, what people were able to sacrifice and where. So the Chachamim had said, Kol Shatziborim in the last few lines of Kufyut Zayin Amabek, Kol Shatzibor Makrivim Ba'oel, right? Then you have to really read the whole thing on the bottom of Kufyut Zayin Amad Aleph. If they did it in the Oel Moed in the Midbar, they would also, everything they could do there, they did in Gilgal. Bekam lo korban yachid ela olau shtamim bilvad. But you couldn't do, right, in the Bama Ktana, the Bama Gdola, you can only, if you were an individual could only do on both a Bama Gdola and a Bama Ktana, on the small and the big, could only do Ola and Shlamim. They weren't able to bring any obligatory offerings. So the first thing the Gemara is going to do is, Mai Tamayu de Rabbanan. What's the reason for their opinion? Amakra, Isha Yashar Be'enav Yaseh. If you remember, that's a pasuk we've read a whole bunch of times. Moshe tells the Jewish people in Sefer Devarim, don't do like you do today, which is now what you've been doing in the desert is everybody, right, when you get into the land. Don't do like we do today. Everybody does whatever they want. Now notice the words ish, everybody, or any person, and it says kol yashar be'enav. Yashar means whatever they want, meaning optional, right? Not obligatory. So what do they learn from here? Ish yisharot to likriv, chavot lo likriv. People are only doing yisharot, only things that they opt into, but not obligatory offerings. V'tzibor, but the community afilu chavot likriv, but they are doing obligatory offerings. Rabbi Yehuda who disagrees and says that the yachid also could bring obligatory offerings. So as long as it's in the Bama Gdola, not in the small places, but yes, they could bring obligatory offerings in the central Mishkan. Amar Lacha, how would he explain that pasuk? Kiktiv hayashar be'einav. What does it say? Hayashar be'einav. What's good in his own eyes, which means wherever he wants, he can do that. Meaning wherever he wants, he can do, like that's referring, the yashar is only to the bamot ktanot, wherever they want. But when it comes to the Bama Gdola, the one place where there's a central tabernacle, whether it was in the Gilgal or in the desert, they could bring their own thing, right? They could bring obligatory offerings. That Yashar pasuk is only talking about wherever they want. But on the Bama Gdola, they were able to bring obligatory offerings. Elahaktiv ish. So what do they do with that word ish, which sounds like individual, right? Any individual can only do yesharot and can't do obligatory ones. So Rabbi Yehuda would have to say, right? So lav l'meimar. First, the Gemara says, doesn't that seem to indicate the ish yesharot hu delikriv hachavot lo likriv, that a person can bring only things they opt into and not obligatory ones? So the answer, no. Rabbi Yehuda can use ish for a different drasha. Kiktiv ish lachshir tazal. What he wants to say ish means any person can actually do the avoda. They can do the work in their bamot. In other words, you can bring your own individual offering and you can do the work. You don't need kohanim. So they say, what? How do you get it from there? You actually get zar from a different pasuk completely. Zar mi v'zaraka kohen et adam mizbach Hashem nafka. There's a pasuk that says, and this is darshaned out elsewhere, that it says the kohen spills the blood on the mizbach Hashem in the Oel Moed. What do you learn from here? The kohen does it in Oel Moed, but outside, anyone can do it. So there you have, Zar can do it outside on the individual bamot. So why do you need ish to exclude that? So we're back to saying, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with ish? To which they say, no. You really can't completely learn it from Bizarak, because that's learning it from, it's not It's not, the Kohen is only supposed to do it in the temple or the Mishkan, but outside the Mishkan, other people could do it. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute, that's an extra jump. Because Mao detema livai kiddush bechorot kemeikara. Maybe when they were in Gilgal, they needed, the bechorot did it. In other words, yes, it's true the Kohanim can only do it in the Mishkan, but maybe in the Bamot, anyone could, the firstborns, maybe we're going to revert back to what it was originally. Kamash malan, that's why you need ish to say, no, anyone can do it. So if you just had the pasuk about the Kohen doing it in the Mishkan Hashem, you might have thought, in the Mizbeach Hashem, in the altar of God, you might have thought that in the, when there was in Gilgal, maybe actually even in the Bamot Ketanot, you need the firstborns, Kamash malan, therefore comes to teach you, no, you don't. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yehuda needs the zar, the ish for, to say even a zar can do it. Okay, now we want to go back to Chachamim for a minute. If you remember, there was Rabbi Meir, the rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbis, Rabbi Shimon. So we're on the second position of the rabbis. But the Gemara now says, Chachamim hanu tanakama. They're really very similar. If you look back for a minute, the Chachamim's opinion was lo kervu yachid elo olot u'shlamim bilvad. The individuals only brought olot and shlamim. They didn't bring obligatory offerings. And then the second opinion of Chachamim basically says the same thing. It just adds, right? Whatever was done in the desert was also done in Ol Moed, in the Gilgal, when they were in Gilgal the first 14 years. Which is basically, that second line is exactly what they said before, and it doesn't sound like the first line is really adding anything new. So what's the difference? They sound like they're saying the same thing. To which Amar of Papa, the machloka between them is, did they do libations in the desert? Back to a machloka we had already a whole discussion about. And then the question is, who holds what? Who holds they did libations, who holds they didn't? So the assumption is when we have two opinions and they seem to be the same, the second one must be coming to add on to the first. So the first one is saying they didn't do libations in the desert, and the second is adding they actually did do libations in the desert. Now, if you're wondering how this really comes out of here, so let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, the Rabbanan Batrai, the second group, right, must be the one saying, skipping to the wrong one. So in that Rashi says here, L'Rabbanan kamai lo kirvu nesachim b'midbar. According to the first rabbi position, they didn't do nisachim. And when it said olot shlamim, they only did olot and shlamim. Okay, without nisachim, what he means. Okay. And then we said, right, in the midbar they didn't bring them. And then again, ki tavo, right, then when you get to the land, you do libations. It's coming to say you do libations when you get to Shilo. Okay, but the Rabbanan Batrai, I'm skipping a few lines, litfuyeyat, or coming to add on. And then when it says this extra phrase, okay, the Rashi says it from that extra line, kol shatzibor makrivim ba'ol moed shebamidbar makrivim b'Gilgal. What are they telling you? Right? Because it didn't really seem to be saying anything new. So what they want to tell you is, they did nisachim in the midbar, they continued that in Gilgal as well. And then, right, they're saying, I'm just skipping down, and then ki tavo, what's ki tavo telling you then when you get to the land? It's just saying that you also need libations on the Bama Ketana, because the big one they were already bringing from the desert. Okay, that's what Rashi explains. And we're done with that section. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Shimon. Amar. Rabbi Shimon Omer. My time at Rabbi Shimon. So let's go back to Rabbi Shimon. What does Rabbi Shimon say? At the very bottom of Kufid Zayin Amar Aleph. Af tzibur lo hikrivu el psachim v'chovot shekavua lehem zman. So what do we say here? The rabbis, he said, the community. The community only brought psachim and anything that's like psachim, meaning they're obligatory offerings that have a specific time frame, like the korban tamid every day. Okay, so now we're going to see, where does he get this from? Tichtiv. Vayasu b'nei Yisrael et Pesach beGilgal. Now you know why he mentions Pesach out of all of them. He could have said korban tamid or something, but he says Pesach because he's going to learn it from this pasuk. When they got into Gilgal, when they got there, crossed the Jordan, it was the 10th of Nisan. And it says they did the Pesach in Gilgal, right? 4 days later, they did the Korban Pesach. Pshita, isn't it obvious they did the Pesach? You have to remember. In the desert, they didn't really do the Pesach very much because then they didn't have Brit Milahs or they didn't do it, or all sorts of issues. So they didn't do it in the desert, and they did it when they got to Gilgal. Now, they say, but it's kind of obvious they would have done it. Why not, right? So if you remember, they get to the land and they do Brit Milah and all these people that they didn't do while they were in the desert. You can't do the Korban Pesach if you're not circumcised. So they get to Israel, they do their Brit Milah, and then they bring the Pesach. So isn't it kind of obvious, though? What's it coming there to tell you? Ela hakamash malan dechovot ke'em Pesach hu dekarev. Halav ke'em Pesach lo karev. They want to tell you they did the Pesach and they did any sacrifices that were like the Pesach. That's why Rabbi Shimon specifically used that language, Pesach and anything like it. This comes from this pasuk. But anything that wasn't like Pesach, meaning it wasn't an obligatory offering that was connected to any time frame, they didn't do it, right? So, idach, now, the other opinion, who disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, what do they do with this Pesach? Why are they telling us about Pesach? According to him, it's very clear. They want to tell you exactly which sacrifices they did in Gilgal. So the other opinion, those who disagree, they need it for some other completely different statement, which is Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Bena'a Arel Mekabel Haza'ah. If you're uncircumcised, you still can be sprinkled with the para aduma, the red heifer waters, to purify you from the dead. Now you have to remember they were in the desert. People died in the desert. They didn't purify themselves. So before they did the Korban Pesach, they had to purify themselves. Now how'd they do that? Well, you have to sprinkle on the 3rd day and on the 7th day of your purification. Now if they came in on the 10th, the assumption is, most of the commentaries say, they did their Brit Milah on the 11th because they needed to rest. They weren't going to do the Brit Milah the first day when they were tired from their journeys. So they waited till the 11th. Now if you wait till the 11th, and then after you get circumcised, then you can sprinkle the paraduma waters of day number 3. Then 11 is going to be day number 3. 12 is going to be day number 4. 13 is going to be day number 5. 14 is going to be day number 6. That's the day you do the Pesach. You're not going to actually be able to do the sprinkling till the 7th day, till Tevet, till the 15th of Nisan, and you won't be able to do the Korban Pesach. So the reason why they told you they did the Pesach was because it was to teach you, even on the 10th, when they were uncircumcised, they were able to do the 3rd day Haza'ah, sprinkling, which meant they were able to do the 7th day on Yudala, and they were able to bring the sacrifice, their Korban Pesach, that year. Okay, and that resolves what the other opinion does with that pasuk. Okay, so we did so far the reason for the rabbi's position, how they differ from the other rabbis that were mentioned in the braita, and the basis for Rabbi Shimon's position. And then each time we had to do, how did the other explain those psukim? Now, Tana Kamei de Rav Ada bar Ava. So someone brings a braita before Rav Ada bar Ava that says the following: Ein bein bama gdola la bama ktana ela pesach v'chavot hakavu aleim zman. Meaning you can't bring on the small bamot, the Pesach, and the obligatory offerings that are connected to time. Which sounds like you can bring nidavot, voluntary offerings on the small bamot. Now, the next few words in my book are in parentheses, so I'm skipping them. After this Tana brought this braita to Rav Ada, he said, Amar le, Titargim nitach ba'ola chova. It must be talking about, there's a comparison here between obligatory offerings and their comparison in voluntary. In other words, obligatory are brought in the bamot. You can't bring obligatory in the bamot yachid, but you can bring voluntary ones. So we're assuming that the obligatory ones you bring are parallel to the voluntary ones, meaning if you can bring voluntary olot and shlamim in the bamot, in the small ones, then the obligatory offerings you can bring are olot and shlamim. Okay, the ones you bring in the bama gdolah. But he says it must be olat chova. It must be the sacrifice they brought were burnt offerings that were obligatory, not sin offerings. Ika olat nedava, right? What's the reason? Olat chova, because there is olat nedava. The comparable case there has to be. They brought chovot that they could bring them voluntarily on the bamot ktano, but obligatorily, right? If they were obligated to do it in the bama gdolah, now on the big bama, now right, the central place, the mishkan, basically. Now it has to be something again that if you brought the olah in the bama as a voluntary, then you could bring it as obligatory inside. But the ichata, but it must not be when he talks about these time-bound, right, offerings. They're not talking about the sin offerings, for example, that you bring on Rosh Hashanah, because now again there's some girsa issues. then, and mine actually takes out the next words, but adds in the following words. Chatat nedava mi'ika, but there is no such thing as a voluntary sin offering. So they didn't bring sin offerings even on the Bama Gdola, it seems. Now they say, why did you specifically say Ola? You could say Minchat Chova. There were obligatory mincha offerings, and there were also voluntary mincha offerings. We have to find something that there's both voluntary and obligatory. Ta'ika chavitin. There's the mincha chavitin of the Kohen Gadol that he brings every day. So that's an obligatory offering. So why don't you say mincha? Well, we're going to say kasavar e mincha bebama. Rabbi Ava, who didn't suggest that, must have held that they didn't do minchas in the bama. Right, as we saw before, there were no libations, and there were no minchas, according to some opinions. Ba'u l'Shilo. Now we're back to the next part of the Mishnah. And they got to Shilo. Then they say Shilo was built it was a stone building with no roof. They just covered it with a curtain. So it's a little bit of a strange thing. Menanimili, where do we get this from? That's how the Mishkan looked. So they say, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ketuv Echad Omer. Now we're going to say there's seemingly contradiction between psukim. First, we're going to quote from Shmuel Aleph when it discusses the Mishkan and Shilo, and then there's some references to it in a parak of Tehillim Ayin Chet, 78. But Tevi'eu Beit Hashem. So Ketuv Echad Omer. One pasuk says, okay, I think I might have skipped the words. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ketuv Echad Omer, but Tevi'eu Beit Hashem Shilo. They would bring it to the house of God in Shilo. Calls it a house. Ketuv Echad Omer, a different pasuk says, Vayitosh Mishkan Shilo, Ol Shikem Ba'adam, which is talking about the Shilo as a Mishkan. And K'tiv, which Mishkan usually is something more temporary. And K'tiv, Vayima'es Ba'ol Yosef, U'b'shevet Ephraim Lo Bachar. Now, until now, they've been talking about Shilo. Those two last psukim are all in the same chapter of Tehillim. And maybe they even brought the first pasuk just to say we're talking about Shilo. When it says, Ba'ol Yosef, he despised the oil of Yosef. The oil of Yosef is the Mishkan, which was in the area of Binyamin, in the property or the Nachala. I can't think of the word right now, but the area that was apportioned to Binyamin, to Yosef. Sorry, I'm confusing up the later sugya. We're going to have a whole machloket. Was it in Binyamin? Was it in Yosef? Okay, this clearly associates it with Yosef. Anyway, the point being right now is there's Shilo is called a bayit and Shilo is called an ohel, and those seem to contradict. A bayit is not an ohel. A bayit is a house, and an ohel is a tent. They're two very different things. HaKitzad, how did this work? Well, lo aytashem tikha elavani milamatan v'yuriyot milamalan. Okay, so the point is it didn't have a roof, like a proper ceiling. The ceiling was temporary, like in a tent, but the walls were permanent, like a house. So it had parts of both. Some people take out those words because it's not really connected. Some people think it's the beginning of the next section. Some people think it's, and that's why it was called menucha. Remember, we said until you get to the menucha and the nachala. The menucha is Shilo, the nachala is the temple, right? So it's this in between, getting there toward nachala, but you're not yet there. Kodshim. Now this is really not, they didn't quote the important part that they're going to deal with. Kodshim, when there's a Mishkan in Shilo, where do you eat kodshim? Within the walls of the Mishkan. That makes sense of Yazara. And kodshim kalim and maaser sheni, you eat anywhere you can see. Now we're going to have to have a whole big discussion. Where do we get it from? That wherever you can see Shilo is where you can eat. So we're going to have 4 psukim. Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, da Amar Kra. So again, Menahanimile, where do we get this from? Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, da Amar Kra. Hishamer lecha penta leolotecha b'chol makom asher tir'eh. Notice the word. Any place that you see. So now it says, this is the pasuk where we learned already, the prohibition for offering sacrifices outside of the temple, outside of anywhere. Now, what does it say here? Don't offer your olot anywhere you see. Now, the way we understood it, right? Anywhere you want, basically. But why does it say see? Well, from here they learn, b'chol makom asher tir'eh iyata ma'aleh. Now, anywhere you see, you can't offer. But what can you do? Well, what's not mentioned in the pasuk? Now, this is a very strange drasha, but what they're saying is, it says you can't offer it anywhere you see, but if you see the Mishkan from where you're standing, you can actually eat. You can't offer, but you can eat. So you're outside, but you can see. Oh, that means you can eat there. To which the Gemara says, you come to a ridiculous conclusion if you're going to take that drasha, because then you could say, maybe it means wherever you see, you can't offer, but you can slaughter, which we know you can't, because you can't slaughter outside. Well, they say, I'm a Rabbi Yana. Rabbi Yana says, no. We're going to say it's offer up, but not eating, but it's not offer up and not slaughtering. Slaughtering, of course, you're liable for outside. Why is that? Because Amar Kra, we saw this pasuk already and explained it like this already, Sham ta'aleh v'sham ta'aseh. It says in the pasuk, there you should go, there you should offer it, and there you should do. What does do mean? Do is all the actions of the korban, including slaughtering. So from here you see that slaughtering is obviously only done in the place inside and not outside, even where you can see. But it does teach us that you can eat outside as long as you can see. Again, it's really a drasha. It's definitely not the simple reading of that pasuk. Okay, next, Rav Avdimi bar Chasa Amal, second opinion. Amar Kra velo ta'ana Shilo. Okay, the first thing to note is Rashi points out there's no pasuk in the Torah that says this actually. It's a pasuk in Yehoshua, which says a little differently. It's talking about a place where the borders are, right? In Yehoshua, they go through a lot of the borders. And it was talking about a border, and it says velo ta'anat Shilo. Again, it says va'avar mizracha ta'anat Shilo. It doesn't exactly say it the way we said it here. The point is, though, there's a place called ta'anat Shilo. Makom, now what is ta'anat Shilo? So ta'anah, we're going to see, comes from the language of sign, li'aneach, to sigh. Anacha is a sigh. And they're going to say, Makom shekol ro'eoto mitaneach alav al achilak kodshim shelo. It's a place where anyone who sees it sighs, because they say, oh, we could have, at one point we ate kodshim here, and now we can't anymore. And it's like sighing about the destruction of Shilo. Ta'anat Shilo is like the place where people cry over Shilo, cry over what was lost. And they associate it with anyone who sees this place, which they connect to, well, anyone who sees the area surrounding Shilo. What they're saying, this Ta'anat Shilo wasn't Shilo itself. It was the surrounding areas where you could see Shilo from there. And the reference here to Ta'anah is that's the place where people mourned and said, oh, I wish we still had Shilo. We could eat there. There's a bit of a question here. This was in the time of Yehoshua when there was still Shilo. But somehow you'd have to say it was a reference to a name that kind of got tacked on later. Or at least it's just a drasha on its name, that later people are going to cry over this place that, oh, people used to eat here. So from there you learn that anywhere where they could see Shilo, which is this area outside Shilo, then you could eat kodshim. Third source, Rabbi Yehuda Amar. The next two sources are going to be from a blessing to Yosef. We talked before how it's in the area of Yosef. And we're going to take the two of the brachot, one from the two brachot Yosef gets, one is from Vayichi, and one is from Vizora Bracha. So one was given by Yaakov, one was given by Moshe. First one is from Yaakov, Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Amakra ben Porat Yosef ben Porat alei ayin. Okay, this means ben Porat Yosef means Yosef is a fruitful vine. Ben Porat, he's very fruitful, alei ayin. Now, alei ayin, right, means something else here, but we're going to use it as ayin as an eye, seeing. Ayin, and it's basically a blessing to Yosef. Ayin shelo ratzta lazun ulehenot. Okay, the eye that saw the wife of Potiphar and wasn't seduced by her, so he wanted to go with her and enjoy being davar. Sorry, he didn't want to sleep with her and enjoy anything from davar she'eno shelo. He didn't want to benefit from anything that didn't belong to him, that belonged to Potiphar. Tizkeh v'tochal b'kimelo eineha. He will end up eating and enjoying as far as his eye can see. That's the alei ayin. Porah, Rashi says, milashon poriyah, lefrot v'lirbot, is a reference to the kodshim. There's so many kodshim that get to be eaten, and they are alei ayin, that Yosef can eat them as far as his eye can see, meaning as far as he can see the Mishkan. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, fourth and final answer here. Amal ulitzon shochni sneh. This is from Vizora Bracha. Sneh is a bush, right? That we know it from the burning bush of Moshe. It's with a samach. But in the world of drasha, you can switch sin and samach. So if we use sin, it's hated. And what does that have to do with hated? Well, they're going to say, ayin shelo ratzta lehenot midavar she'eno shelo. Again, they bring in this eye, the eye of Yosef that saw the wife of Potiphar and didn't succumb to her seductions, her seducing him. Tizkeh v'tochal ben hasnuim. Will be worthy that he will be eaten by among those who despise him, who despise Yosef, his brothers. The point is that there's areas around Shilo that belong not to Yosef but to his brothers, and they're going to be able to eat as long as they can see Shilo. Now, what does that help Yosef? Well, they're always looking at Shilo. If they look at Shilo and they realize that it's on account of Shilo that they get to eat, account of that they can see it, so that benefits Yosef. It's kind of glorifies Yosef. Okay, so 4 very kind of, each one not a very easy drasha, not very simple or straightforward. Tana. Now we're going to have a braita about this thing of ro'eh. Ro'eh sha'amru, we're going to define it. And again, we have a girsa problem. I'm going to skip the next few words, and I'm going to look in the footnotes I have in my book, which tell me change it to ro'eh sha'amru, the ro'eh that we're talking about, koshu ro'eh ve'ein davar mafsik beino lebeino. Anyone who can see without any sort of barrier between, right? Sometimes you have a view that's obstructed. It basically means an unobstructed view. Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim le Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim said to Rabbi Elazar, Ezber alach kegon be'knishta de ma'on. I'll give you an example of something like that where they could see directly, like the Beit Knesset in Ma'on. And that was an example he brought. Okay, next. Right. Rashi says that was just a place that had an unobstructed view of Shilo. Amar Rav Papa, another explanation of what it means to see, a little different. Not like he's disagreeing with the braita, he's just bringing another thing, which is ro'eh amru lo ro'eh kulo ela ro'eh mikzato. Even if you just see part of it, that's enough. You don't have to see the whole tabernacle. You just have to see, or the whole Shilo. You just have to see part of it, and then you can do it. Now, just 1 second. Okay, now, we're kind of in stuff that's not so relevant. I wanted to bring a relevant, interesting halacha. This idea of ro'eh comes up in a totally different context in Birkat HaMazon. When you bench, to say Birkat HaMazon, you have to be in the place where you ate. Now, the Chayei Adam in his halachic work, in Hilchot Brachot, Klal Nun Tet, Halacha Vav, says, basically, Nir Eli, it seems to me, afilu halach lepetach chatziro, even if you went to the entrance of your courtyard, v'kosh kemicheder lecheder, even to a different room, v'yachol lirot sham mekomo arishon, and you can still see where you originally ate. As long as you can see, you can bench. It's very known, okay, right? People move and they sit somewhere else, but I could see where I was eating, so I can bench here. So the footnotes there, or not exactly footnotes, but notes within that note say, so I think his proof, because it's not clear where he gets it from, and he even says, it seems to me, that's what the Chayei Adam said, it seems to me. So the comment there says, seems to me that, where did he get this from? From our sugya. As long as, from Rav Papa, basically, and he quotes Rav Papa saying, as long as you see part of it, it's enough. Okay. By Rav Papa, Omed v'ro'eh, yoshev ve'eno ro'eh, mai. What if you're standing, you can see, but if you're sitting, you can't see? Does that mean you can see? Does that mean you can eat? There's a debate what exactly this question is about. Perhaps it means even when you're standing, maybe you can't. Or maybe it means even when you're sitting, maybe you can't. Because if you were standing, you could see, even though right now you can't see. And by Rabbi Yirmiyah, not surprising, Rabbi Yirmiyah adds to this question, Omer al gabe hanacha v'ro'eh, or yoshev or betoch hanacha ve'eno ro'eh mai. Take. So what if you're on the banks of the stream, or you're actually standing in the stream, right? In the stream, you're obviously lower down. So if you could see in that higher point, but then you go into the stream and you can't see anymore, again, would you be able to eat? And the answer is teku. We don't have an answer. Ki'ata Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi. Rav Dimi came from Israel. He said in the name of Rabbi, B'shlosha mekomot sharta shechina al Yisrael. And now we're going to get to this big machloket about where was the Mishkan in Shilo. Was it in the property of the tribe of Yosef, or was it in the property of the tribe of Binyamin? So Rabbi says, and Rav Dimi quotes him as saying, there were 3 places where the Shechina dwelled on Israel: B'Shilo, v'Nova Givon, u'Beit Olami. So Shilo, Nova Givon, and the Beit HaMikdash. U'Bekulan, and in all of them, Lo Shata Ela B'Chelek Binyamin. It was only in the area of Binyamin. This goes against what we saw before. Shene'emar Chofef Alav Kol Hayom. Back to the blessings of the brothers. So Binyamin, it says in Dvarim, this is Moshe's blessing. Le Binyamin Amar Yedid Hashem Yishkon LeBetach Halav Chofef Alav Kol Hayom U'Bein Ktefav Shachin. This basically says that God is dwelling in the presence of Binyamin. And it says, Chofef alav kol hayom, which means God is basically dwelling there all his days. What is all his days? Kol chafifo le'yu ela b'chol kosha binyamin. All the places where God dwells was always in the tribe of Binyamin. Ki azal Abaye, when Abaye went, Amrei kamed Rav Yosef, he went before his teacher, Rav Yosef, and he said to him exactly what he heard Rav Dimi say. Amal, Rav Yosef's reaction is very harsh, especially if you remember, Abaye's father died before he was even born. Okay, Rashi says Chayil was the name of his father, or at least Rashi says, I think it was the name of his father. He says, I think, because it's a very strange name. But that seems to be the way to read this. One son Chayil had, and he is not mitakan, he's not so great. Crazy to be saying this about Abaye, even crazier to be offending him like with his father. Oh, you're your father's only son. He never even met his father. But anyway, and you're so off. Why? Haktiv. And we're going to now quote the parak of Tehillim we saw before. We talked about Shilo. Vayitosh mishkan Shilo uchtiv vayim'as bo'ol Yosef u'b'shevet Ephraim lo b'chal. There they're talking about the mishkan of Shilo, and then they call it the Ol Yosef. From there you see it was in Yosef's property, not in Binyamin. So Amar Rav Ada, my kakashile. Rav Ada says, what's so difficult to Rav Yosef? Dilma shchina b'chelik Binyamin v'sanedrei gdola b'chelik Yosef. He says maybe the shchina was in the shevet of Binyamin, but the Sanhedrin, which was right next to the Mishkan, okay, which we're going to see, how do we know that, was in the tribe of the portion of Yosef. So the Shilo was still, part of it was in the property of Yosef. How do we know? We have a similar thing going on in the temple. And that we get from the Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda, Mechokek Mibei Maglav, Mechokekim, or in Judea, meaning the Sanhedrin Agdolah, which sat in the Lishkat HaGazit, which was it was right off the temple courtyard, was in the tribe of Yehuda. We even talked about something about the Mizbeach also, which we're going to mention soon. We learned about earlier in the Masechet. So just like there it was in two properties, maybe also here the Sanhedrin was in one, and the place where God's presence was in the other. So Amarle, Rav Yosef says back to him, Hachi Ashta? There the Nachalot were right next to each other. It was both in Judea and in Binyamin. And here they weren't close to each other. To which he answers back, okay, Rav Adu is trying to protect Abaye, Hachanami Mekarvan. Here also they were near each other. Keda'amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, Ritzu'ah hitayotzet mechalko shel Yehuda, v'nechneset lechalko shel Binyamin, u'ba haya mizbeach banui. Okay, so there was this strip. This actually we learned on Daf Nun Gimel. There was a strip coming out of the portion of Yehuda, and it went into the portion of Binyamin, and that's where the Mizbeach was built. Remember that part of the Mizbeach was in the section of Yehuda. V'haya in Judea. V'haya Binyamin atzadik mitzte'er ala lebal'am. Binyamin always wanted to have it completely in his property. Hachanami, and we can then say the same thing for us, Ritzu'ai tayotzei mechalko shel Yosef lechalko shel Binyamin. V'hainu dichtiv ta'anat Shilo. Here's a different drasha on ta'anat Shilo. That also, it was mostly in Binyamin, but part of it was in Yosef, and that's why it's called Yosef, and that's why it's also called Binyamin. And it's called ta'anat Shilo, not for the reason we saw before, that people were saying, woe to us who can't eat here anymore when we used to. But it's actually when Shilo was in existence, it was Binyamin, it was sighing all the time, I want it all in my possession, just like with Yehuda in the temple. So it sounds like there's a way to make these two opinions work together. However, the Gemara points out, Kitanai, this is actually a debate among Tanaim. Chofef alav, and here's a drasha, Ze mikdash rishon. Notice what's missing. It's the first temple, Chofef alav. Okay, we're going to have three drashot on this pasuk. Chofef alav is mikdash rishon. Beit mikdash rishon, the first temple. Kol hayom, Ze mikdash sheni, second temple. Ben ktefav shachen, Eli yamot Mashiach. Binyamin will be worthy that the first temple, the second temple, and in the times of the Mashiach, God will dwell in his presence. Rebbe Omer, and then it excludes the Mishkan. The Mishkan wasn't in the tribe of Binyamin. But Rebbe Omer, Chofef alav ze olam hazeh. Chofef alav is in this world, meaning any time God's presence is anywhere, in the Mishkan, in the temple, it was always in Binyamin. And notice it was Rebbe who was the one who Rav Dimi quoted before saying the same thing. Kol hayom, the second drasha is Eli Yom Mashiach, the times of the Messiah. Ben ktefav shachen ze olam haba. That's in the afterworld. Okay, so you have these two different approaches which are based on that. From here we're going to get to the end of the daf, all about numbers and How do we know all the years that we've been talking about until now? Tanu Rabbanan, Yemei Ol Moed Shabamidbar Ara'im Chaser Echad. How many years was the Ol Moed in the desert? 40 minus 1. Why 40 minus 1? We'll see soon. But because the Mishkan was built, we said already, it was put up on the second year. So it was around for 39 years, not 40. Yemei Ol Moed Gilgal, it's Arba Esrei, right? In Gilgal, it was 14 years. That was the 7 years of conquering, 7 years of settling. Sheva Shekivshu v'Sheva Shechalku. That's what I just said. 7 conquering, 7 settling. Yemei Ol Moed Benova Givon 57. Ol Moed and Nova Givon were 57. Nishtayru l'Shilo. How much are left for Shilo? Now, what does it mean? How much are left? Well, we know because when Shlomo builds the temple, he says it's been 480 years since the Exodus from Egypt. So if we get rid of, right, then we have to now say, okay, so set 480 years from the Exodus from Egypt. Take away the 40 years of the desert, you're left with 440. Take away the 14, you're left with 426, right? The 14 of Kibush and all that. Take away 57, right? That gets you down from, what did we, just lost my, right? 426 minus 57, you're going to get to 369. Okay, so how many are left? What's left is, in other words, those are things we know. We're going to have to prove how we know that. So what's left is the balance. The balance is, right, it's basically 440, just to make it simpler. 440 was the time they were, right, from the time they got into the land. Then add 57 and 14 is 71. So basically take 71 years away from 440 and you get to 369. Okay, so that's the Shilo, Shlosh Me'ot V'Shiv'im Chaser Echad. Say 370 minus 1. That was just the way they counted off it. Like we have it in Malkot. They're 40 minus 1. Okay, 39. Yemei Ol Moed Shabamidbar Arba'im Chaser Echad Minala. Now we're going to go through each one. How do we know how long these were? So in the Midbar, that's going to be very easy. The first year he built the Mishkan. Shniyahu Kama Mishkan. The second year it was put up. V'shalach Moshe Meraglim, and he happened to send spies that year as well. That will become relevant very soon. Okay, but that explains 39 years. Shebi Gilgal 14 shekavshu v'sheva shechalku 14 shekavshu. Sorry, 14. 14 in Gilgal, Sheva shekavshu, 7 the conquered. Sheva shechalkan minal. And how do we know it was 7 and 7? Right? This is something we talk about all the time, but where do we know it from? Deka'amar Kalev, ben 40 shana anuchi b'shloach Moshe eved Hashem oti mikadesh barnei levargel et haaretz. V'ashiv oto davar kasher hayayim levavi. So Kalev gets to the land, and after the 7 years of conquering, he wants to get Hebron in his possession. He says, I want that to be mine. So he gives this speech. He says, I was 40 when Moshe sent me to spy on the land. And then, Ukti, Va'atahine anochi hayom ben 85 shana. And today I'm 85. So now we have to do the math. Ki avre liyarden bar kamahave. How old was he when he crossed the Jordan? If he was 40 when the Chet Meraglim happened. Now they do something strange. They don't count the year of the Meraglim. That year doesn't count. So basically what they say is he was 38 years in the desert. Even though it really should be 39, but they count it as 38 because they say first year they hadn't sent the spies. The second year was the year they sent the spies. And then there's 38 more years. So he was 40 basically at the end of that year, I guess you would say, where he was sent as a spy. And then we basically add another 38. So that gets us up to 78. So how many are left? Now he says he was 85 years old now. So that's exactly 7 years. Right? There you have the 7 that they conquered. How do you know there were 7 years that they were dividing up the portions? Who gets what? Well, the simple is, well, there were 7 to conquer, so there must have been 7 to settle. Make it very even. Okay, this is much more complicated. There's a very long Rashi on it, which will be part of it. There's a pasuk in Yechezkel where he says, I'm standing 14 years after the destruction of the temple. And he says, I'm standing on Rosh Hashanah. And then he says, and I'm standing on the 10th of Tishrei. Now, Rosh Hashanah is not on the 10th of Tishrei. It's on the 1st of Tishrei. So they say, it must be, now, sometimes in the Jubilee year, there's a thing about Yom Kippur being like Rosh Hashanah. Okay, I'm not going to get into all that, but let's just go with that assumption. The Yom Kippur is sometimes called Rosh Hashanah when it's the Jubilee year. That means that 14th year after the destruction was a Jubilee year. Okay, why is that relevant? Well, basically what they're going to say is if you don't say that there were 7 years of settling, then the count's not going to work. Because what's the issue? When do they start counting the Jubilee year? When they finish conquering and finish settling. So at the end of those 14 years, now we're going to do the count assuming it's 14, 7 and 7, and that's going to prove it has to be, it's the only way that 14 years after the destruction, we're going to be in a Jubilee year. So if you count 14, right? So now, what did we say before? There were 480 years till they built the temple. The other number you need to know is that there were 410 years the temple was around. So the first temple. So you have 480 plus 410, that gets you up to 890. Okay, now take away 40 of the desert and 40, right? That's going to give you 850. Now we're already there because if we went into the land right then, if we started Jubilee counting right then, the Jubilee year would be exactly the year of the destruction. 850 years later, it's divisible by 50. Jubilee year is the 50th year. So now, if you have the 7 years of conquering and 7 years of settling, that's the exact 14 that we need to push off the starting of the Jubilee year, so that when the temple was destroyed, we're 14 years later is the Jubilee year, and that's perfect. Okay, because then you have 836 years until the destruction, plus another 14 will get you to the Jubilee year. And that's how we know it was 7. And how do we know this? That Novin Givon was 57. Okay, this is the pasuk in Shmuel this is when Eli falls and dies, and that's when the Mishkan leaves. The Mishkan is no longer in Shilo; it moves to Nov. So it says, Vitana, the braita says, Kishemet Eli Kohen Charva Shilo. Okay, it actually never says in the pasukim it was destroyed, but they say that was what the drasha is, that it was destroyed. Ubau the Nov, and they went to Nov that year. Kishemet Shmuel Aramati Charva Nov Ubau the Givon. When Shmuel died, then they moved to Givon. They moved the Mishkan. Uchtiv. Okay, so now we have to understand. Let's try to get the timing. Okay, now when they returned the Aron, if you remember, the Aron was attacked. It was taken by the Plishtim in that battle when Eli died. Then it was given back 7 months later, but it was stayed in Kiryat Yarim. It wasn't put in the Mishkan. Now it says from the time it was returned to Kiryat Yarim, by your boy Yamin v'Yoslim Shana, there were 20 years that it stayed in Kiryat Yarim. We're assuming that's 20 years that the Mishkan was in Nov, right, and then moved to Givon. So we'll have to figure out how this worked exactly. Vayinahu kol Beit Israel. Right, we're not going to get how many years was in each place. We're going to basically get how many years altogether. So Vayinahu, and then we know basically there was Shmuel, then Shaul becomes king, then David becomes king, and then 4 years into Shlomo's reign is when they built the temple. So we're going to have to get to, that was 57 years from the time it left. It got taken. There was 20 years in Kiryat Yarim. That's when the Mishkan moved to Nov. So Vayinahu kol Beit Israel acharei Hashem. Okay, that's just the pasuk. Hani Yisrim Shana. So what was the makeup of those 10 years? Who was ruling? Because we're going to count it by rulers, basically. Eser Shana shemalach Shmuel batzmo. There were 10 years where Shmuel, he wasn't malach, he wasn't a king, but he was the only ruler. Then Shana shemalach Shmuel v'Shaul. Then there was a year that they overlapped. Then Shtaim shemalach Shaul. Then Shaul had 2 more years of kingdom, and then it moved to David. Sheva de David, and then another 7 of David. If you remember David, we're going to just keep reading a drop into the next daf because we're kind of leaving you hanging. Okay, so first he was 7 years in Hebron. So if we do the count, 10 years with Shmuel by himself, 1 and another 2 with Shaul, that's 3, 13. Another 7 of David in Hebron, that's 20. So the first 20 when he was Kiryat Yarim basically ends when David becomes king of all of Israel. Then you add another 33 years. So basically we have 20 plus 33, that's 53. Then we add 4 more, as we said, started building it 4 years into his kingdom. Okay, so that gets us up to 57. Now again, so they're just going to end with as we said before. If you're going to basically say there were 480 years from the time they left Egypt, and then we take away the 40 of the desert, and then we have the 14 of the conquering, and then we have the 57 at the end that we take off of Nov and Givon, we're left with 369 of Shilo. And with that, we finished for today. So what did we do? Quick review. We started with the opinions that we still had to finish with the rabbis, how they disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and what, where they each bring, what's the source for the rabbi's position. How does Rabbi Yehuda deal with his psukim? How did the rabbis differ from the earlier rabbi's position? What are Shmuel's psukim? What's his proof? And how do others explain the psukim in a different way? When they got to Shilo, why was Shilo with kind of like a house, kind of like a tent? And we said it worked as both. Then we had, how do we know roeh? We have 4 sources that anyone who saw Shilo was able to eat there. That's where kodshim kalim could be eaten. Then we went to what other things about roeh. It has to be unobstructed view. It could be even if you see just part of it, though. Unobstructed view of part, I guess you would say in the end. And then we had this machloket in the end about, was it in Binyamin or was it in Yosef or was it somehow in both? And we saw different opinions about that and ended with the count of how many years there was a Mishkan and how many years it was in each place and where we get that from in the Psukim. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.